Aloha, everyone. I'm Mark Levin. I'm the director of the Center for Japanese Studies. I'm thrilled to be here in a new school year. I'm thrilled to be here in our first time with a hybrid programming. And my principal request to both those of you in the audience in person and those of you in the audience online is please be nice to us because it's our first time. So we've got our fingers crossed and we're optimistic it's all going to go well. Those of you in person, you do not need to put your questions in Q&A. We'll see your hands go up. You were just welcomed, and I actually want to welcome Tatsuki Kohatsu. Today is his first day as our center's graduate assistant. And so we're delighted to have Tatsuki assisting our team as well. I'm going to leave the introduction of Dr. Gordon to my colleague, Gei Satsuma, who is the Associate Director for the Center for Japanese Studies. But before I do, I just want to say that when I came to the University of Hawaii, Sharon Minicello was the Director of the Center for Japanese Studies. And I'm so, it's very special that today's event is presented in her memory. Many of us remember her very, very warmly. So I'm really thrilled for that. But let me ask Gay to come up, introduce Dr. Gordon, and we look forward to a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor David Gordon to the University of Hawaii. I've known David for a number of years because I also served as the Associate Director for the Center for Japanese Studies when Dr. Minicello was our director, and Dr. Minicello was David's mentor. Dr. Gordon is a professor of history at Shepherd University. He studied at UH for his graduate studies, and his committee or the professors were so impressed by his training and his commitment, they waived the masters. So this is the first time that I've heard that they waived the masters in history. And he entered the doctoral program with a field concentration in intellectual history, modern Japanese intellectual history. And I don't know of anyone else actually in the history department that graduated with that specialization. As I mentioned before, his advisor was the late Dr. Sharon A. Minicello, whom we all loved a great deal. He's been teaching at Shepherd University since 2000, and he served as department chair, and he gained tenure and promotion to full professor. So I want to congratulate him on his excellent work, as well as his teaching in Asian civilizations, many different courses that you've developed and you've taught. So that's a wonderful record, as well as serving as a visiting professor, faculty exchange in Taiwan at Nanhua University fairly recently, before the pandemic anyway, in fall 2019. His major publications is a monograph titled Sun Yat-sen, Seeking a Newer China, Library of World Biography series, Pearson Preston Hall. And he also authored multiple articles, and many of them were in the AAS publication, Education About Asia, which I'm a great admirer of. And I'll just give you two titles, A Tale of Two Diplomats, Ho Feng Shan, Sugihara Chibune, and Jewish Efforts to Flee Nazi Europe, fall 2015. And another title, Prodigy of Taiwan, Diva of Asia, Teresa Tang. So it's a distinct pleasure to welcome David. And he will give a lecture on Contending with the Modern West, Japanese and Yiddish satires in the era of high imperialism. This lecture is co-sponsored by our history department. Thank you.
Almost failed. Hello, aloha everyone, and welcome to my presentation. As Dr. Satsuma noted, I was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii in the 1990s. And of all the excellent professors I had while I studied here, in the interest of time, I will single out just this one, Dr. Sharon Minichiello. So as Dr. Satsuma noted, she was my major professor, and I believe she is also responsible for my becoming a professor at all. I had originally come to UH in 1990 as a master's student. I wasn't even sure about a PhD at that point. Dr. Minichiello, though, slowly reeled me into the history program where I took a variety of classes, passed qualifying exams, and then spent several years writing a dissertation about philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro's early work on Friedrich Nietzsche's notion of will to power. During my period of working with her, Dr. Minichiello became the director of the Center for Japanese Studies and an important force in its growth and development. She died in 2018, so I gratefully dedicate today's presentation to her. So a few points before I start. First, let me clarify that today's presentation is very much a work in progress that I'll be refining over the course of my sabbatical this fall. So its conclusions are provisional. Also, to any Yiddishist in attendance, Jewish studies is not my field, and I don't currently read Yiddish well. With an English translation, I can locate a given phrase within a Yiddish text. Now, strictly speaking, Meiji Japan isn't my field either. I focus on the subsequent early 20th century Taisho period. So in that respect as well, this presentation is something of a thought experiment that I do intend to revise and publish, but that even more, I hope inspires others to make further East Asian/East European comparisons moving forward. All right, so today we're going to be concentrating on two satirical novels. These novels were written in the era of rapid industrial transformation that Mark Twain called the, quote, raging, tearing, booming 19th century, unquote. One of the novels comes from Japan's Meiji period. This is popular rights activist Nakae Chomin's A Discourse by Three Drunkards on Government, Sansuijin Keirin Mondo. It came out in 1887, an inflection point in the history of Japan's modernization efforts. The other novel comes from Eastern Europe. This is the Mare, M-A-R-E, Die Kleatsche, by the so-called grandfather of Yiddish literature, Sholem Abramovitch. The first edition of this book came out in 1873, 14 years before Chomin's Discourse. So one of our authors, Chomin, was a political activist trying his hand at fiction, while the other, Abramovitch, was primarily a novelist. Both Chomin's Discourse and Abramovich's The Mare were written in times of difficulty for their respective peoples, the Japanese in the one case and East European Jews in the other. And the difficulties were coming from the West, and particularly European countries, as they increasingly flexed their muscles worldwide. Both novels explore this circumstance and at least hint at solutions. At the same time, both authors wish to caution their readers against at least one possible outlook, which is idealism, naivete, in the face of this dangerous new environment. To express this message, both works have substantial satirical elements. Thus, I should start by saying a bit about satire in general. I'm going to be drawing here particularly on literary analyses from the 1960s and 70s, when there was a good deal of discussion of this topic. Based on these analyses, satire entails the use of humor to expose and criticize foolishness and or knavery, so folly and or evil. In order to have satire present in a piece of writing, there needs to be both wit and an object of attack. Wit alone is just humor, while attack alone is just condemnation. Satire can be conservative, holding that things were better in a stabler past. Alternatively, it can be revolutionary, maintaining that society today is absurdly orderly and riddled with conventions. Now, as literary genres go, comedy develops toward an ending that features integrating or reconciling conflicting individuals or groups. Tragedy, meanwhile, develops toward an ending that features learning bitterly hard lessons in order to establish some sort of future. In contrast with both of these, satire likes to leave things unresolved. 18th century English author Samuel Johnson's novel Rasselas ends with a chapter titled Conclusion, in which nothing is concluded. And indeed, in pure satire, with no other genres intermixed, the standoff between satirist and satirized remains unresolved. In short, satire is a very distinctive mode of fictional writing, and there are at least elements of this mode present in the two texts we'll be looking at. So let's turn first then to Nakae Chomin. Is he full screen now, or?
Click to the word that PowerPoint slideshow.
So
Share to there.
share to this, okay.
And yeah, you got it.
Right, here he is, Nakae Chomin. So Nakae Chomin, born as Nakae Tokusuke, was born in Tokugawa, Japan's Tosa domain in 1847 as the eldest son of a low-level ashigaru, or samurai foot soldier. During the Bakumatsu period, the tumultuous final 15 years of the feudal Tokugawa era, Chomin studied foreign languages, eventually settling on French. At age 20, he interpreted for Léon Roche, France's ambassador to the Tokugawa regime. Following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, he sought to join the Iwakura mission to Europe as an exchange student. Indeed, he even stopped Minister Okubo Toshimichi's carriage on the street to gain a chance to participate. Okubo did give him this chance, and Chomin proceeded to France, where he studied under figures like the Rousseauian philosopher Émile Acalas. After returning to Japan in 1874, Chomin established a foreign language school and for 2 years worked for the government as well. He translated Rousseau's Social Contract into Japanese and became known as the Rousseau of the East. He also became involved in the popular rights movement, an organized push for elected local and national assemblies and the promulgation of a National Assembly created constitution. The base for the popular rights movement was disaffected ex-samurai who in many cases were looking for a way to assuage their pride from their lost social status. For the most part, Chomin focused on creating a theoretical basis for the movement rather than taking direct part in its demonstrations. Nevertheless, he did briefly work with Saionji Kinmochi, the noble and politician, to publish a pro-popular rights movement newspaper called the Toyojiu Shinbun, or Eastern Free Paper. In 1887, as the popular rights movement was beginning to recede, he published the book that is the center of our attention, a discourse by Three Drunkards on government. Discourse is a very intriguing fictional work. As its title suggests, it consists entirely of a conversation among three drunk individuals. The first figure to appear is Master Nakae, or Nakae Sensei. He's the host for this lengthy session of drinking and talking. He's described as a pleasant fellow, though one whose ideas about geography and history grow rather strange as his drinking continues. People sometimes visit his house to drink with him and ask his views about Japanese national affairs. Nakae always forgets afterward what he said, so he decides that the next time he'll write everything down and turn it into a book. Sure enough, two new guests appear one day with some brandy, and so we have our book. That's the setup. Basically, we've entered a liminal space separated from everyday life. The bulk of Abramovitch's The Mare will likewise take place in such a space. We never learn the names of the two additional guests, but Nakae will call the philosophical one gentleman, Shinshi, while he calls the adventurous one champion, Goketsu. Although there's a certain amount of give and take among them, essentially, gentleman, our idealist, speaks first and longest, almost 39 pages in Nobukotsukui's English translation. Champion speaks next, a little more briefly, about 29 pages. Finally, upon their request, Nakae speaks at the end, briefest of all, about 15 pages. If you've seen the 1980s indie classic movie, My Dinner with Andre, you have some sense as to the flavor of this. Speakers at a dinner table conversing at length as they push each other about why they think as they do. So our three characters represent three approaches to Japan's predicament, which was how to stay safe in an ominous modern environment. Historian Marius Jansen points out in his foreword to the English edition that as of the mid-1880s, when the book was written, Meiji Japan seemed to be losing ground. France had defeated China. China had won a struggle against Japan for influence in Korea. And the Meiji government had failed to achieve the revision of its so-called unequal treaties with powerful Western nations. In this set of circumstances, Gentleman remained an idealist. Champion was a cynic, and Master Nakae was a realist. These are strictly my terms, which I'm using to set up my comparison with Abramovich's The Mare. Chomin's idealism consisted of his belief that the god of evolution, Shinkashi, was driving humanity towards democracy, though some European countries, such as Russia, were having trouble absorbing the message. To get a bit of the flavor of his thinking, here's how Gentleman starts his long, almost uninterrupted soliloquy. Quote, democracy, democracy. Absolute monarchy is stupid. It is unaware of its faults. Constitutionalism is aware of its faults, but has corrected only half of them. Democracy, though, is open and frank without a speck of impurity in its heart, unquote. Gentlemen will argue that if a small nation on the edge of Asia, meaning Japan, were to adopt pacifism as its guiding principle, this would cause, quote, the European nations who take vain pride in their civilization, unquote, to feel ashamed, since Japan would be acting on the values that European countries tend only to espouse. At the end of Gentleman's presentation, ranging over European affairs, Champion asked a hypothetical. What if a nation were to take advantage of Japan's unilateral disarmament to invade? Gentleman responds, quote, we could simply cry in a loud voice, how uncivil and inhuman you are. We would then be shot to death, unquote. Champion chuckles over the weakness of such a god of evolution. As this exchange suggests, Champion is far more cynical. His character was evidently based on that of the nationalistic figure Saigo Takamori. So for any Yiddishists out there, please already be thinking about which character in the Mare Champion may resemble. Here's how Champion starts. Quote, no matter how detestable it may be for scholars, war exists and is an inevitable force in the actual world. Moreover, it is our nature as animals to love victory and hate defeat, unquote. Champion will hold that the pleasure that comes from victory is truly pervasive. Whether a cat is catching a mouse, children are hitting dogs with sticks, or scholars, like Gentlemen, are getting angry to defeat rival scholars. Indeed, there'd be nothing virtuous about refraining from all this strife. That would be sheer cowardice, weakness. And anyway, he contends victory is fun. Champion's cynical, nasty solution to Japan's predicament is that it should invade a certain large country in Asia or Africa. He's, quote, forgotten, unquote, exactly where it is. This country is rich in natural resources, but is weak, with a government that is, quote, good as nothing, a big fat sacrificial cow, unquote. He asks, quote, why shouldn't we go and tear off a half or a third of that country, unquote. If Japan did so, quote, our small nation will instantly change into a Russia or a Great Britain, unquote. Any guesses as to which country he means? Anyone from the in-person audience?
Directly across the water.
Yeah, China. I was thinking of China. Yeah. Champion will go on to argue that in any country where there are lovers of nostalgia and lovers of novelty, he proposes that in Japan's case, the lovers of nostalgia should go invade the large country, like the samurai of old, while Japan's lovers of novelty can hang on to the original Japanese islands. At the end of both soliloquies, our tipsy realist Master Nakae will try to split the difference, characterizing Gentleman's ideas as strong liquor that makes him dizzy, and Champion's ideas as harsh poison that rips his intestines. When both figures press him to express his views, Nakae states that the ideas expressed by both of them are, quote, empty words, unquote. I'll save a part of his critique for later when I compare our two texts directly. Broadly, though, Nakae feels that both characters have reached their extreme views because they, quote, share a common disease, excessive anxiety, unquote, cardio. They don't see that there's a balance of power among the main European nations, and that as such, they'll tend not to act precipitously. At this point, Gentleman and Champion ask, in unison, if a powerful country does attack Japan anyway, how should it respond? Nakae says that the Japanese military must resist, and that indeed it should be adequate as a defense force. From here, he moves on to critique Champion's advocacy for foreign invasion. He suggests regarding China in particular that Japan should befriend it and use it as its chief economic market. When Gentleman and Champion press for a more concrete plan for Japan's future, Nakae states commonplace opinions for the time that Japan should become a constitutional monarchy with a friendly diplomacy and should gradually move toward free speech. Both guests are underwhelmed, but Nakae insists that Japan's future is much too important to seek out novel arguments for their own sake. Keeping things slightly loopy, he claims that 2 or 3 years have passed since the start of their conversation. And so our guests depart. I certainly haven't done justice to the contents of this complicated novel. Still, I hope you see that it's a serious effort to examine Japan's circumstances broadly, rather than in terms of what was happening daily or weekly in the ongoing struggle between the government, the oligarchs ruling through the emperor, and the dissident popular rights movement. In terms of satire, Discourse both states and implies criticism of the naive idealism of Gentleman, as well as of Champion, as we saw. It is not conclusively conservative or revolutionary. All parties agree that Japan's earlier traditions are not returning, but the radical changes proposed by Gentleman and Champion, respectively, are shown to have their own difficulties. In terms of satire theory, this actually fits better with more recent discussions, such as Charles Knight's idea that satire esteems doubt over certainty, and Dustin Griffin's idea that satire ought to be regarded as an open-ended inquiry into problematic conditions rather than a straightforward attack. In any case, even though nothing gets resolved in Chomin's book, in the tradition of satire, there is at least some sense of comic integration, as all parties affirm the pleasures of drink, even if they can't see eye to eye on the affairs of the world. In effect, the center holds, even as Japan's broader situation continues to cause serious unease. While keeping in mind our idealist, cynical, and realist figures from a discourse by Three Drunkards on government, let's turn our attention now to the other side of Asia, indeed all the way over to Eastern Europe. This is where Sholem Abramovich's classic, The Mare, was published in 1873, again, 14 years before Chomin's Discourse. The title of this lecture indicates that this work was written in Yiddish, a language that wasn't used for modern style literature prior to the later 19th century. So I need to say a bit about Yiddish first before we explore the contents of the Mare and compare it with Discourse. But the first thing to be aware of about Yiddish is that it is not Hebrew. Both are languages associated with the Jewish people, but historically they served different purposes. Hebrew is an ancient language akin to Latin. It's the language of the so-called Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, as well as other ancient Jewish texts. When Jews scattered following the destruction of the ancient temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, a number of them moved into Italy and then northward into France and Germany. Oops. Is this full screen right now, or? Okay, so it's being shared as full screen. Okay. So those who moved up into southern Germany here picked up the German language, Middle High German. Next, they mixed in some Hebrew religious terminology and wrote out their vocabulary in rich German using Hebrew letters. Scholars call this Judeo-German. Enter the Crusades. The medieval Christian crusades, especially the first one, were highly damaging to southern German Jewish populations who were direct objects of attack. Over time, a number of these Jews moved eastward into Poland, where they received assurances of safety and economic freedom. Conditions would change in later centuries. As Jews moved into Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe, they would keep their Judeo-German, but would blend in more vocabulary from the countries they were entering. So now the language they were speaking was a deep mixture. A medieval German base, yes, but with plenty of vocabulary from both ancient Hebrew and contemporary Slavic languages. So this is something like Japanese, with its ancient indigenous base, its Sino-Japanese highbrow vocabulary, and its numerous borrowings from modern English. In any case, the mix that is Yiddish became the primary language of everyday life within East European Jewish communities, even as Hebrew was retained for formal religious purposes. At its height in the 1800s, Yiddish may have had as many as 11 million speakers, more than half of the Jewish population worldwide. The majority of these speakers were killed in the Nazi Holocaust of the early 1940s. Most of the remainder moved to monolingual environments like the US and Israel, where they shifted to the national language where they now lived. Today, Yiddish is mainly used as a vernacular by ultra-Orthodox communities in New York City and Israel. Now, in the 19th century, in which Sholem Abramovitch spent the bulk of his career, much of Eastern Europe was under the control of Tsarist Russia. This area included central Poland, as indicated here, so cities like Warsaw, Lodz, Lublin, as well as today's Lithuania, Belarus, and most of Ukraine as well. It was called the Pale, or region of settlement, the one area within Russia where Jews were permitted to live. These Jews were heavily taxed and were forbidden to practice a number of occupations, rather like Chinese immigrants to 19th century California. Abramovitch lived nearly all of his life in the Pale of settlement. He was born and raised in today's Belarus, up near Lithuania, and then moved south to what is today Ukraine in search of a teaching job following the early death of his father. Abramovich's father had been influenced by Haskalah. Haskalah was a movement to bring the ideals of the German Enlightenment into Jewish life and practice. At least initially, Haskalah did not call for Jews to abandon basic religious rules, but it did emphasize science and greater social integration with the non-Jewish majority. Effectually, Haskalah functioned in the Jewish context much as the ideal of Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, did in Meiji Japan, or as the Shinwan Hoyundun, the New Culture movement, did among educated youths in early 20th century China. Early to mid-19th century Haskalah already foregrounded satire, but it was satire of an emotionalistic religious movement called Hasidism. This latter featured Jews of humble occupations who followed charismatic, allegedly miracle-working rabbis. The anti-Hasidic satires were written in Hebrew, which actually means they were difficult for the less educated Hasidic rank and file to understand. Sholem Abramovitch, himself a follower of Haskalah, would likewise write satire, but would soon point it in other directions, including at himself. For what it's worth, Abramovich's first foray into fiction was an anti-Hasidic satire. And by the way, can we move this? I guess we can move his image up, but can we move it out of full screen?
So
full screen share, yes.
we had a little complexity.
Mhm.
Right now, basically the audience is seeing you and the screen behind you.
Oh, okay.
In a physical manner, but
Okay.
all there very well.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Great. Right, so again, Abramovich's first foray into fiction was an anti-Hasidic satire. For his second novel, though, he shifted to Yiddish so he could reach a broader audience. In that novel, he focused on depicting everyday life in a realistic manner. He also established the gambit for most of his works as a character he named Mendele Mocher Sephorim introduced the main text in a wry, humorous manner. This character, literally Mendele the book peddler, was so popular that Abramovitch himself is often called by that name even now. The character Mendele will introduce the Mare as well. Abramovich's third work, the one just before the Mare, was a play called The Tax. This referred to an extra tax on kosher meat that Tsarist Russia imposed. To recompense for themselves for their efforts, some Jewish merchants collecting this tax would raise the tax much higher, something Abramovitch found abhorrent. His mockery of this self-dealing was a break with Haskalah, whose advocates usually turned to merchants for support. On the other hand, his respectful approach to the czarist government that imposed the tax was vintage Haskalah. Advocates habitually maintained that Jews should ingratiate themselves to the governments under which they lived. And indeed, Abramovitch dedicated his play to the mayor-governor of the city of Odessa, His Excellency Nikolai Novoselsk. 2 years after the tax was published in 1869, a several-day-long pogrom occurred in the city of Odessa. Pogroms were massive physical attacks on the city's Jewish community and its members with the overall connivance of government authorities. Though such attacks had occurred before, this was the first one to take place in Russia after the reforms of then Tsar Alexander II. So it's now a modern government and police force that's allowing this to happen. This suggests that not everything is going according to the Haskalah movement's optimistic plan. Remember, Abramovitch had dedicated his play to Odessa's mayor. And this has implications for our topic, because in the wake of this pogrom, Abramovitch is going to make a sharp break with his own Haskalah idealism. Enter the Mare, a novel published in 1873 with an idealist, a cynic, and a realist. The story is prefaced by Mendele the book peddler explaining that someone gave him the story, titled The Mare, when he lost his own real-life mare or horse for moving his cart of books. So like Discourse, this book has a fictional explanation for its own existence. Now, unlike Discourse, lots of supernatural things happen in The Mare. These take place within 2 periods of vision, or really mental breakdown, that the idealist figure experiences. However, the story is meant to function as a broader allegory about the circumstances of 19th century East European Jews. Rather than a stylish gentleman, as in Discourse, our idealist here is an intense, rather neurotic young man in a Ukrainian Jewish community. Remember that most of Ukraine was administratively part of Russia at this point. The young man's name is Israelik, a Russified version of Israel. He's going to be a kind of everyman, representing the Haskalah Enlightenment ethos as it meets reality. Israelik has decided to study for entrance into a Russian university so he can become a doctor. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work out. Along the way, he has to master a variety of subjects, including Russian folklore. The folklore, it turns out, includes a Slavic witch called Baba Yaga, whose horses speak like human beings. Under the pressure of excessive study, this triggers Israelik's first vision. In the vision, he sees children harassing a mare, a female horse, by throwing stones at it and setting a pack of dogs on it. He's a member of the Society for the Protection of Animals, so he confronts the boys and tries unsuccessfully to stop them. Commentators point out that this society is a stand-in for the Petersburg Society for the Promotion of Enlightenment Among Jews, a Haskalah group. Anyway, once the kids and dogs leave, Israelik helps the mare using Furtish, or horse language, to communicate with it. To Israelik's great surprise, the mare begins to respond in actual Yiddish. As Israelik recovers from his fright, the mare explains that it's not really a mare, but a prince who overstayed his welcome in ancient Egypt and has since been transformed into the wandering mare, like the wandering Jew. Mendele already declared in his introduction that he sees in the mare, quote, all our little Jewish souls, unquote. So the reader has been primed for this allegory. Over the course of his 2 visions, Israelik is alternately protective of and angry at the mare, much like the Haskalah movement, which was both protective of and angry at ordinary Jews who largely spurned its progressive message. At one point, Israelik writes a lengthy letter to the Society for the Protection of Animals and hears back from it that he should only protect the mare once she's learned the proper social graces of a well-bred horse. So for those in Japanese studies, this approach resembles that of the Rokumeikan, the Viennese-style ballroom and banquet hall built in Tokyo in the 1880s to convince Western diplomats that Japan had achieved civilization. Anyway, our mare will have some sharp things to say about the social graces approach, leading Israelik to shout that the devil has entered her. This in turn leads the devil himself, called Ashmedai, to appear and to continue Israelic's education about East European Jewish conditions through harrowing flights above the earth. As you can imagine, all of this is allegorical. Israelic represents the idealism of the Haskalah movement. The devil represents the knavery, the sheer cynicism of the Russian Tsarist government. And the Mare represents the hard-bitten realism of East European Jews as a whole. So, Israelic, idealist, devil, cynic, Mare, realist. This is like in Discourse, gentleman, idealist, champion, cynic, Nakae, realist. Let's proceed to compare these books, starting with our two idealists. As we've seen, Gentleman in Discourse extols democracy, which he regards as the final outcome of human evolution. His view in this latter is both deterministic and optimistic. Quote, evolution means to proceed from an imperfect to a perfect shape, to change from an impure to a pure form, unquote. Addressing the, quote, several hundred million free people of Europe, unquote, he states, Gentleman states, quote, you have indeed passed through the dangerous stage of savage conflict and have entered the system of peace and civilization, unquote. Bunmei Seido no Ansei. Japan, in turn, may be able to go even further, becoming, quote, a laboratory for democracy, equality, moral principles, and learning, unquote. Effectively a beacon even for the West. How about our second idealist, Israelic? His letter to the Society for the Protection of Animals regarding the Mare begins, quote, the virtue of mercy is so entrenched and so widely accepted in our time that men have not only begun to commiserate with one another, but have ceased to bear malice, to torment others, and to twist their minds as they used to in the old days, unquote. They have now moved away from discrimination on the basis of nationality and religious belief, and their new mindset extends to their treatment of animals as well. Accordingly, Israelic states proudly, quote, our day and age deserves to be called the humane era, unquote. Die Zeit von Menschlichkeit. Essentially, while Gentleman stresses equality based in political freedom as well as education, Israelic stresses goodwill, cultured goodwill toward people and animals alike. Although the focus is somewhat different, an intense optimism pervades in both cases. And in each case, there's some kind of divine force backing up the realized or about to be realized vision. The modern day God of evolution in Gentleman's case, and God in a broadly Jewish/monotheistic sense in Israelic's case. As a major example of their idealism, both figures critique modern nationalism for how it divides and polarizes people. Here's Gentleman on the subject, quote, if sovereignty rests with the people and there is no other ruler, a country's name simply designates a certain part of the surface of the earth. There are no borders between oneself and others, and there arises no hostility. Democracy creates a single, large, complete circle embracing the entire earth, unquote. And here's Israelic criticizing modern nationalists. Quote, God created man with the same kind of soul for all men alike. You, however, strove to, you meaning the nationalists, you, however, strove to outsmart the Lord's work and couple this soul with another, a sort of folk soul. And these folk souls are all too often antagonistic, unquote. So when I use the term folk here, think of folk as in the German V-O-L-K, meaning nation. In short, for Gentlemen, the nexus of democracy and pacifism is both necessary and sufficient to bring about human flourishing. For Israelic, it is mercy, rachmanos, based in education and issuing and refined behavior that will bring this about. Our idealists are attacked by other characters in each novel. First, the characters, I should say the idealists, are both considered crazy. When Champion first hears Gentleman expresses pacifism, he says, quote, have you lost your senses? You're mad, unquote. Kill city, kill city. In like manner, Mendele characterizes the author of the Mare as Israelic the madman, Israelic the Meshuggah. And the Mare herself tells Israelic, quote, in all likelihood, you're crazy, unquote. With this as our starting point, let's turn to our cynics, Champion and the Devil, respectively. They maintain that the idealists are, well, too idealistic. As we have seen, Champion attributes a desire for triumph to all people and animals. This resembles the devil's concept in the Mare of the law of the belly, which is simply that all living things crave food. Olafilm Essen, quote, all yearn to live and breathe as best they can by any means, foul or fair, unquote. Overall, Champion sees nature as amoral. Quote, every living thing between heaven and earth, from the insects to such beasts as tigers, lions, coyotes, and wolves, lives by catching and killing its prey, unquote. This resembles Mendel's sarcastic prayer at the opening of the Mare, which treats man as a microcosm of all God's creation, including, quote, the lizard, the leech, the Spanish fly, the Prussian cockroach, and to top it all off, a devil and a werewolf, a clown, a Jew baiter, and many another uncanny foe of man and scourge of God, unquote. As the theme of amorality comes to the fore, God in whatever form withdraws. In Discourse, the God of evolution is shown to be defenseless against any foreign power that cares to invade Japan. Meanwhile, in the Mare, the devil describes God as, quote, being cramped for space, little by little, and retreating, withdrawing from the scene, unquote. This is actually a characteristic of satire in general, as literary critic Alvin Kernan points out, quote, the author of satire may believe that God still exists, but when he assumes the mask of the satirist, he acts as if God and nature were withdrawn, unquote. When the cynics are at the fore, we're closer to what critic Northrop Frye called, quote, the innate nihilism of satire, unquote. And indeed, both of our cynics love vistas of destruction. Champion enthusiastically describes battle scenes in the sense of transcendence they inspire. Here's an example, quote, when a battle is about to start, men become almost mad and their courage begins to boil over. They are in a new and completely different world. Where is there any place for pain, unquote. He also speaks of, quote, the pleasure of a commander, and it is a very great pleasure indeed. Mr. Gentleman, you may choose writing for your pleasure. Let me choose war for mine, unquote. While Champion fancies an attack on China, the devil fancies pogrom-style attacks on Jews. First, he flies over a Romanian pogrom with Israelik in the palm of his hand. Then he has Israelik scan the scene below. So this is Israelik. Quote, I beheld throngs of people running wild, descending like locusts upon houses, hurling stones at windows, breaking down doors, smashing and crushing everything in their path, attacking young and old with bestial ferocity, unquote. He pleads, that is, Israelik pleads for an end to such wars, but the devil says, quote, that's no war, it's merely a new sort of game, unquote. And when Israelik asks why it's happening, the devil says, quote, what does it matter whether there's a valid reason or not, as long as they come to blows? It's a sport of sorts, unquote. As a further indication of their view, both cynics hail the contemporary ramping up of military-focused industrial production among European countries. Along these lines, Discourse in particular has passages that sound like predictions of World War I to come. For the cynics then, war is a plus. Those who oppose war are often scholars, and both cynics mock them. At one point, Gentleman calls out, scholars, we need scholars. Champion tells Gentleman, though, quote, in every realm, a distinction exists between theory and practice. Theory wields power in debate, but practice achieves results in the real world. You deal with the theory, Mr. Gentleman, and I'll discuss practice, unquote. In like manner, the devil tells Israel, quote, your trouble is that you are not a practical man, but a dreamer, and not merely a dreamer, but a master of sophistry, pilpul. It is precisely the sophist habit of delving for new meanings, which is the great fault of your brethren, whether they're in the marketplace or the house of study, unquote. The world that Chomin and Abramovitch portray is one in which the outlooks of the cynics carry considerable weight. The idealists are fools, satire-deserving fools, if they brush off the cynics as mere remnants of a benighted past. And indeed, in the 1930s and 40s, the ideas of our cynics will be applied in East Asia and Eastern Europe, respectively. Nevertheless, there is some difference in the late 19th century situations that our authors depict. In the Japanese case, there is Japan itself, for the time being, still unconquered. At one point, Gentleman describes Japan as a, quote, child prodigy, unquote, and states, quote, there is no telling what this child will be like in the future, unquote. Champion, for one, hopes that Japan will, quote, abandon a sinking dinghy, the Japanese islands, and leap aboard an unshakable ship, China, as soon as possible, unquote. That interferes, of course, with Gentleman's aspirations for Japan as the nation that will teach Europe to take its own best values seriously. In either case, though, Japan has a future that could be quite bright. In contrast, Abramovich's outlook is fairly grim. Regarding the earth and the devil, his now disenchanted Israelite states that, quote, no other planet is as suitable for his diabolical purposes. There he has his puppets and accomplices, unquote. Meanwhile, the Mare, symbol for the Jewish people as a whole, is a repeatedly attacked, repeatedly mastered, worn-out animal. She may have the integrity of resilience going for her, but not a lot else. Speaking of the Mare, let's turn to our realist figures, Master Nakae in Discourse and the Mare in the Mare. As we do this, the contrast between the outlooks of our two novels will come further to the fore. As I mentioned before, Nakae tries to split the difference between gentleman and champion. Regarding gentleman in particular, he stresses that gentleman is talking about ideas that have never been put into practice. The Mare, meanwhile, argues that Israelite is talking about ideas that he himself doesn't really put into practice. Specifically, after Israelite's grandiose letter to the Society for the Protection of Animals, Israelite sees a local peasant beating a donkey. He tries to stop the peasant, but the peasant gets angry and chases him away. The Mare, seeing this, asks Israelite sharply, quote, tell me, is violence still rampant in the world or isn't it, unquote. Israelite, who had proclaimed the advent of the humane era, could only lower his head in shame. This highlights a difference between Israelite and gentleman. Gentleman's outlook combines an emphasis on education, mercy, pacifism, with an emphasis on political rights, especially those that a people have fought for in the face of opposition, what Discourse calls retrieved rights. In the Mare, though, these two sides are split apart. Israelite represents education and mercy, while the Mare represents political rights. What takes shape is something like the difference among later 19th century African Americans between Booker T. Washington, who stressed the attainment of civilization as defined by whites, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who stressed the need to gain political rights through struggle. This sort of contrast is at the core of the Mare's critique of Israel. The Mare, so the character, presents a description of progress from humaneness to utilitarianism to justice. Israelite is stuck down at humaneness, but what the Mare wants is justice. As she states, quote, I want to live on an equal footing with others, on my own merits, that is. As for your mercy, humanness, and any possible advantage you may derive from me, utilitarianism, I place no reliance on these possibilities, unquote, since both mercy and usefulness can wane depending on circumstances. Again, in the case of gentlemen, this split doesn't exist, so it doesn't become part of Nakae's critique of him. Instead, Nakae's critique is that any god of evolution, such as gentleman is celebrated, is far more varied and complex than gentleman makes him out to be. For example, Nakae says that the Asian god of evolution likes aristocrats and promotes them over commoners. The only thing the god of evolution doesn't like, he claims, is if people try to achieve something that simply can't be done in a particular time and place. An example he gives is promoting full democracy before people's minds have been carefully prepared for it. So Nakae is sounding like a Herbert Spencer style incrementalist here. In short, the realist critiques of our idealist are different because the historical realities they address are different. In Eastern Europe, the Mare's outlook foregrounds tragedy. She stresses to Israelite how much she has suffered. Quote, upon my body you will find depicted in scars legends of the world's cruelty, savagery, and stupidity, unquote. She'll also explain her penchant for grazing in other people's yards by stating that there's no use for her to wait in line for food, quote, for the simple reason that my turn will never come, unquote. On the other hand, there's a scene near the end of the novel where Israelite refuses the devil's command that he swear an oath and ride the Mare as a new accomplice with evil. In response to this refusal, the devil angrily throws both Isserlich and the Mare down towards the earth. As they're falling through the air, the Mare says to Isserlich, quote, "Whenever I fall, I manage to scramble to my feet again," unquote. By this point in the story, Isserlich has shown a Scotch integrity and the Mare has shown her patient resilience. The idealist has finally gotten off his high horse, as it were, schooled by his ostensive student. For the Mare is a work of fiction. That's the end of satire and the very beginning of progress. Turning back to Discourse and Japan, Nakae as a character is guardedly hopeful. In the face of what he calls the excessive anxiety of his two interlocutors, he maintains that, quote, "In international society, the influence of moral principles will gradually expand while physical force will gradually diminish," unquote. Nakae also holds that Japan's potential enemies, like Great Britain, France, and other great powers, quote, "don't have a master plan," unquote, any more than Japan itself does. In effect, in facing the future, everyone is winging it, including the most powerful nations out there. As he states, quote, "A nation's suspicion towards others is its neurosis. If you wear blue glasses, everything you see will look blue," unquote. Thus, even as Nakae critiques the extreme idealism of gentlemen, he'll avoid the form of cynicism typified by Champion that consistently bases itself on worst-case scenarios. This suggests basically what I've been arguing all along, namely that Discourse is the more optimistic work, as based on the relatively less straitened circumstances of the Japanese people. We need to remember, though, that Discourse is not a catechism, with Nakae, priest-like, clarifying final truths for the other characters. When Chomin wrote Discourse, he put occasional comments in the margins that sometimes undercut the characters making their arguments. So more or less his own peanut gallery. At the point where Nakae is about to deliver his final remarks, he wrote, quote, "Master Nakae prevaricates," unquote. Nakae sensei gomakaseri. This is a reminder for us not to put final stock in Nakae's perspective, but instead to measure it against our impressions of the other two perspectives, themselves flawed. So in Nakae we trust is not the unequivocal message here. Now, there's also a different way of viewing Nakae's relative moderation. I'm going to draw here on an essay titled "The Genealogy of the Dialogue Format in Japan's Intellectual History." This is a piece that noted political theorist Maruyama Masao wrote about Chomin's Discourse. Near the end of his essay, Maruyama suggested perhaps Nakae's conclusion may not have been a moderate standpoint rejecting two extremes, but rather something closer to, quote, nihilism, unquote. This wouldn't be a matter of sweepingly rejecting all political standpoints, though, but rather a severe, mature realism that first took shape when Chomin encountered the horrors of Japan's Bakumatsu-era tumult as a youth. Though Maruyama doesn't discuss it, Chomin served as Léon Roche's interpreter at a very awkward point in the Bakumatsu period. Specifically, in early 1868, the Sakai incident took place. Sakai, a Japanese city open to foreign ships, was where some French sailors attacked samurai from Chomin's own Tosa domain who were providing security. In response, the Tosa samurai killed 11 French sailors in subsequent fighting. Roche demanded that all of the Japanese involved in this counterattack on the French be decapitated. In the end, 20 samurai were selected, and one after another, they proceeded to commit ritual suicide in front of the French delegation. Remember, Chomin is working for Roche here on that side. So once 11 had committed seppuku, the French side announced itself to be satisfied. While there is no specific record of Chomin being in attendance at this event, he was Roche's interpreter, so he probably witnessed what took place, and he may even have influenced its outcome. Given that he was just 20 years old at this point, it would have made a serious impression alongside the other political upheavals of the period. From this vantage point, Japan, and Chomin in particular, had already experienced substantial turmoil in the Bakumatsu era, and there was fear of a return to all this and more should the country incur an outside attack in the future. If we stress this dimension, Nakae's seeming moderation starts to look a little more like the Jewish mayor's patient resilience. I'm not going to resolve this definitively today, but it's something to keep in mind as we consider these two absorbing, disquieting literary works produced during Europe's era of high imperialism. So mahalo for your attention. Arigato, Hashem Dank.
Thank you. How should we do a Q&A? Why don't we, there anything, Joan, why don't you check in the computer to see if there's anything there? And then in the meanwhile, we can begin if there's any questions from inside the room.
There's no questions online yet.
Okay.
Well, doing what Sharon would have done, I'm ready for the questions.
That is what she would have done.
And by the way, Sharon gave the most impeccable introductions of people that anyone could. So Gaya, you did what Sharon would have done as well. I'm wondering about the two works in their contemporaneous setting mercantilistically. What I mean by that is, did they sell? If they sold, to what audiences were they being communicated with? And what do you know, because the authors are probably doing it to make money. So how did that fit the setting of the two works?
Okay, so in the case of a discourse by Three Drunkards on government, I know it was advertised in major Japanese newspapers, but it seems not to have sold too well. And Chomin later seemed maybe, he may have simply been a little bit modest, but he seemed, you know, almost a little bit embarrassed by the work. You know, he described it as kind of childish. And in a way, it was forgotten for a long time, or largely forgotten until after World War II, when it was kind of revived. A modern, more contemporary Japanese rendition was written by Kuwabara Takeo and I think something like Kamada Shinji. At any rate, there was a sort of modernized, updated Japanese version published, and it seemed to have new relevance in the post-war period because, you know, the whole idea of Japan becoming a pacifist nation, well, that really did happen, you know, with the post-war constitution. And at the same time, there also was pushback against that, you know, on the part of the Japanese political right. So the kinds of debates that were taking place within the book had kind of sort of a new resonance at that point. As for Abramovich's work, the Mare, I have seen it described as something that sort of the more intellectual members of Städtlach or small towns in Eastern Europe would have found very interesting, and, you know, to try to sort of unpack the allegory. Abramovitch himself was a very, very popular author. When he died in 1917, there were 50,000 people at his funeral in Odessa. So nobody anywhere gets 50,000 people at their funeral unless they've made a big impression. So I think that answers some of the question of how much it's selling. And yeah, please.
Thank you. I think it was a really interesting presentation. When I heard the title of the talk, I was kind of excited because I was thinking there are not direct connections in a lot of ways that one might imagine and try to make connections. But a little bit later, you could have that when the Russo-Japanese War happened, and you have Japanese prisoners who later learned Russian and translated Russian literature, and you can see the kind of nihilism and the kind of ideological questioning going on with a lot of them. Again, it's a whole other fascinating thing. So both of you, this is all pre that period. So I think the connections are more that you have, you know, in basically kind of totalitarian systems, you have these cultures of Jews in the Pale who are kind of much more exposed to Western Europe, kind of like, you know, as you said, like Sholem and all of these writers are trying to bring in, like translating Freud into Yiddish, or, you know, And actually, they hated Yiddish at first. They kind of looked down at this kind of like language of the please sort of thing, but later they fell in love with it. And I think a key difference that you mentioned is that, you know, in Nakae and Tosa, which was maybe kind of Inaka in the world, but it wasn't the same sense of being like a minority. So yes, you know, if you were in Tosa, you might have had a different future in your life, but it was different from pogroms where you could actually be killed just because of your identity. It wasn't something that you could escape. So I think that that's one interesting difference. Another thing that maybe is a commonality is that, you know, what was the role of censorship at the time? So when you think about, you know, even in the United States, in the McCarthy period, you know, if you wanted to say something about anti-nuclear, you could do that in Godzilla, B movies, and sci-fi. You could smuggle kind of debates inside, whereas you wouldn't be able to do that.
Right. There are issues of censorship with regard to both books. They're both writing, you know, under regimes that are very willing to censor things of which they don't approve. So in the case of Discourse, it's a reason that he's having Champion not mention China by name, but acting sort of coy almost by saying some country out there in Asia or Africa, that it would have been controversial for him to, in the 1880s, to overtly call for an attack on China, given that the two countries were officially friends. And then in the case of Abramovich's book, he could not mention the pogrom in Odessa. So he has a pogrom, he instead has the devil talking about a pogrom in Romania, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time. And he'll also have he'll have the devil like providing ink to I guess, anti-Jewish Catholic writers who were in Bohemia and Moravia, which was also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he puts everything just outside the borders of Russia as a way of escaping the censorship. And even though he did that, the Russian government did not allow a translation of this particular work into either Russian or Polish. And they didn't allow a reprint of the work for another, I think, 16 years. So the Russian government was nervous, basically caught the undertone of that work. It's the only work that Abramovich wrote that got him in, you know, at least a sort of the edges of trouble with the government.
I think that's a really great key difference that we keep in mind. But I think that one other thing that's kind of interesting to imagine is in their minds, the kind of sense of disillusionment. You know, these use of studying the soul and the kind of the idea of French Enlightenment, and sort of like the history of like Japanese Christians, you know, who suddenly, you know, think they're excited by the ideas of humanism, but then they see how the missionaries treat Japanese, or the kind of the American policy, you know, the Immigration Act. You know, how they then say, well, you're not practicing what you preach, and that's formed with the non-church movement or something. You have all of these different flavors of socialism, different flavors of religion, and all of these kind of fissures about, again, with modernity. What is the future? So I think that you know, that stage is just so fascinating. So in the way through these animals and characters, we're able to see the kind of reflection of the society, and it's kind of fun being. Historians, they shouldn't try to make things modern, but we're seeing kind of Trump America and, you know, these kind of very extreme, almost like civil war on some things. What is the future? Can democracy work? Or do you have people who still continue to believe certain fantasies? You know, what does this mean for a future for democracy?
Right. With Nakae Chomin, two figures that are connected with him either in this period or shortly afterward. One is Tokutomi Soho, who in the 1880s, actually, I think it was the year before this book was published, wrote a book called Shourai no Nihon, Japan's Future. And it was saying that the US shouldn't, or not the US, Japan shouldn't put so much emphasis on militarism, but should instead, you know, focus more on domestic development. Now, Tokutomi Soho later will go in a very militarist direction from the time of the Sino-Japanese War onward for the rest of his life, for many decades to come. So he's going to go rightward from where Nakae Chomin was. And then on the other hand, an actual disciple of Nakae Chomin was Kotoku Shusui, who later is going to become a socialist and an anarchist. They're going to go leftward from where Nakae Chomin had stood. Nakae Chomin was sort of a kind of centralist figure, as it were. At least he's sort of on the moderate left, and doesn't really have to, in his day, doesn't have to actually, make a choice of firmly right or firmly left. In that sense, he's a little bit like Sun Yat-sen too. Has the advantage of dying early enough that he doesn't have to commit.
Question?
Any other questions?
So in the end,
Go ahead.
when the both authors, did they later look back at these works and share any of their own observations on what they had thought they had done?
I mentioned that Nakae Chomin seemed a little bit embarrassed. Abramovitch was in the pattern that he would later revise each of his works. And he'll revise this one as well. And in particular, he'll make the last part of the book where the devil is carrying Israel through outer space. He'll make that part about twice as large. And one thing I need to figure out this fall is I've been using kind of a later version, the later version that he wrote, and I'm making guesses as to what was in the original version. Like in the later version, there's going to be more about protecting the environment, being against industrial civilization. And my guess is that stuff that's being added, but I need to find that out this fall.
Great.
Yes, please, you have a question.
We have a question from an online audience.
Yes.
How do you think you might use the material in your presentation in an undergraduate world history class? Are there key takeaways for undergraduate students?
That's probably what the students writing.
Could be. I have actually used Discourse in like senior level undergraduate classes on East Asia. I think with Discourse, to speak of that book for a moment, I think that the difficult thing to get across to students, at least students in West Virginia, is how most of the text is really talking about Europe and European affairs, and yet it needs to be remembered that this is a late 19th century Japanese take on those affairs. And so you're kind of reading it maybe at one level to learn about those affairs, but then at another level to see how they're being viewed. As for Abramovich's book, I think it's a very dramatic text. So in that sense, I think it would work well. I became very intrigued by it because it was, I mean, even though I am Jewish and I've read various types of Jewish works, I had never read anything like this. It wasn't Orthodox Judaism. It wasn't Reform or Haskalah Judaism. It wasn't particularly Zionism. It was like no other voice I have ever encountered in Jewish writing. And at first, until I read more background about it, I sometimes wasn't aware myself how the allegory worked. So I think it's a book that raises a number of question marks in a person's mind. But that can be good to do that to students, to sort of put them through an experience of of sort of almost deliberate confusion. That can be a pedagogical technique. Yeah, so I'm not sure about a freshman course on world history, but I think it definitely can work. And that both of these works can function well in undergraduate courses. And I care about both literatures and would like to see them taught more in schools.
Joan, did you have another question back there, or are we?
That's the only question. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'll wind us down. I want to thank Dr. Gordon. I want to thank our audience in person. I want to thank our audience out there in the world. And we look forward to more of these events. For those of you who enjoyed today and want to tell your friends what they missed, we have recorded it and we do plan to put it on the center's YouTube channel. within a short while. And so you can look forward to seeing it there and let that be known.